My name is Frank Day. I'm an original Ironman, and I graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and do consider myself a trained engineer/scientist, but I'm also a physician, so I also understand the human body. I invented power cranks about 20 years ago. This presentation is to tell you pretty much everything I've learned over these last 20 years about getting faster on a bicycle. The main reason for this presentation is we've always claimed our new users will typically see a 40% increase in cycling power in about one season. Such an increase is not easy to achieve, and it's even more difficult to explain, so many don't think it possible. This presentation is to give you all I know now about what's important to cycling power and how to improve it, and why Power Cranks is such a powerful training tool. I think you will find, after hearing this presentation, that a 40% increase typically seen is not only possible, but probable in most. A word of warning, this issue is complicated, so it will take a while. Stick around. First off, let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. Everyone knows that you can get better by training, and the more you train, the better you will usually get. Additional training may account for 5 to 10% of the increase seen in some new Power Cranks users. What is important to understand is I now also understand there are 3 additional areas that can give cyclists big improvements that are in addition to and separate from the benefits of normal training or training more. These areas are: 1. Increase the muscle mass used when cycling. 2. Change the cycling coordination to something more effective. And 3. Optimize the muscle contraction efficiency. All 3 of these come down to improving your pedaling technique, as all 3 are separate parts of a good technique. After I discuss these, I will then discuss how one might measure pedaling technique, although it isn't necessary to measure technique to achieve a good technique. Let's get started. First thing we need to understand is what we mean by power and where power comes from, since we're trying to increase power. Power is simply a number representing the rate of transfer of energy from the rider to the bike and then to the ground. Power is usually measured in watts, and it can vary depending upon where it's measured, being higher at the pedals than at the wheel in the same person because of various losses during transmission. Comparing power between 2 individuals is meaningless, as there are too many variables. The most important thing about measuring power isn't what the number actually is, but whether you are improving or not. The better trained you are, the harder it is to improve your power. That is why it seems impossible that one can reliably increase power about 40% in reasonably well-trained cyclists simply by using a new training tool. Let's be clear, we all don't have the same potential. What your potential is depends upon a lot of things. Your genes say something about this. Your mix of slow twitch or fast twitch muscle fibers determine whether your best God-given potential is speed or endurance. Choose your sport wisely if you want to become a champion. If you only have time to train 5 hours a week, your potential will be a lot less than if you train 20. But training 20 may give you more potential than training 40 if training 40 means you're always injured or don't rest properly. And of course, nutrition. So we have choices to make when we train, and one of those choices is whether you want to work on your pedaling technique. My goal here is to convince you this is worth the effort. Our potential depends upon things both in and out of our control, and in cycling, if you have good pedaling technique, your potential is better than if you have poor technique. The only question is, how much better? I hope to convince you it's a lot. Regardless of your genetics or how much you train, if you want to maximize your performance in cycling, then you need to maximize your pedaling technique. There are 3 elements to good pedaling technique. First, you need to maximize the muscle mass you are using, and second, maximize your coordination efficiency. A higher efficiency means more power to the wheel for the same effort, and you will be faster than those with a lower efficiency doing everything else the same. And last but not least, maximize the muscle contractile efficiency of the muscles you are using. Maximize muscle mass used, maximize muscle efficiency, and you will maximize your performance, whatever your level. This is important, regardless of your genes, training time, or how much your bike costs, or anything else. You cannot come anywhere close to your full potential without a good pedaling technique. Let's move on. What is a good pedaling technique, and how do you improve yours? Understand that the source of all power on the bike is the leg muscles. Remember when I said one of the elements of good technique is increasing the muscle mass being used? Let's look at the potential muscle mass we can use in pedaling. The more muscle we have, the more power potential we have. So generally, men who have bigger muscles than women have more power than women. And big men put out more power than small men. And we lose muscle mass as we get older. We can increase our muscle mass through strength training, but strength training hurts the other aspect of power important to many cyclists, sustainable power or endurance. This presents a training conundrum. You can't maximize both muscle strength and endurance, so training should be directed towards the kind of racing you do by emphasizing strength, endurance, or some combination. Endurance cyclists especially won't train to increase muscle mass, so they're stuck with the muscle mass they have. So let's ask, is there a way of increasing our cycling muscle mass without hurting our endurance? For most of you, the answer is, you bet there is. Let's examine how. Well, part of this question is how much muscle is in our legs. The other part of that question is, are we using all of that available muscle? To understand that answer, let's examine the muscles of the leg and what they do and how you're probably pedaling now. There are 4 major muscle groups in the legs: to move the hip and to the knee. The quads and hamstrings extend and flex the lower leg, while the glutes and the hip flexors extend and flex the thigh. When one set is contracting, the antagonist muscle should be relaxing and recovering, getting ready for the next effort. And muscles are most effective when they are used to move the foot in the direction the pedal is moving. As long as the muscle force direction on the foot is within about 45 degrees of the pedal direction, it would be reasonably effective. So what does this mean when it comes to pedaling? The quads extend the knee, moving the foot forward and down. The quads can effectively drive the pedal when it's between about 11 and 2 on the pedaling circle. The glutes move the thigh down and back. They start to become effective about 2 and start to lose effectiveness around 5 on the pedaling circle. They would be extremely effective beyond 5, except it is reached near the end of its effective range of motion, and the only way the pedal can start to move up is if the knee moves up. Another question you might have here is, why aren't the hamstrings effective here when the pedal is moving backwards? The reason is, if you take a close look, the knee joint is extending here, and that is opposite to the hamstring's usefulness. As long as the ankle is held steady by the gastrocnemius, the hamstrings can be relaxed here while the glutes are applying power. The hamstrings flex the knee, moving the foot back and up. The hamstrings can be effective and drive the pedal when it is between about 5 and 9 on the pedal circle. And last, the hip flexors. They move the foot upward and forward. The hip flexors can effectively drive the pedal when it's between about 8 and 11 on the pedal circle. One issue with the hip flexor is if the crank length is too long, then the hip angle near the top is near its effective range of motion, and the rider can have difficulty powering the crank over the top, so has to resort to using the other leg to help push it over the top. Not very efficient. So we can see the 4 leg muscles have the pedaling circle pretty well covered. Only one question. Are the 4 muscle groups equal in capability, and are you using them optimally? I'll look at that more closely soon, but this gets us into actual pedaling technique, how to use these different muscles for best effect. But first, let's discuss what I mean by technique and where the power number you see on your power meter comes from. Power equals force times speed, or torque times rotational speed. Above are 2 representations of how a typical cyclist pedals. The left illustration is a vector representation of how the forces change around the circle in both size and direction. The right graph shows these forces translated into the power around the pedaling circle, since only the tangential portion of the pedal force actually provides any power. Look at about 170, where the forces on the pedal are pretty large, but they're not very tangential, so the torque or power there is pretty low. As the tangential force on the pedal changes around the circle, we can see the power at any instant is always changing also. So what does your power meter show? It turns out that the power number you see on your power meter is nothing more than the average of all the little instantaneous power numbers seen around the pedaling circle, the 2 legs combined. This rider's instant pedal power varies from about 450 watts to -50 watts each revolution, but his average is about 125 watts for this leg. That would be 250 watts for both legs total. The number he would see on his power meter. The only thing that matters is the average. Increasing the power at any part of the circle will increase the average, everything else the same. To better understand this, I need to talk more about these pedal forces, where they come from, and why am I talking about it? When scientists have looked at pedaling technique, they have found no relationship between technique and efficiency or power. Many of you may have heard this and may believe technique really doesn't matter and going faster involves just training more and pushing harder. Then again, why am I talking about it? Because that's a myth. The problem is all of these studies equate pedal forces with pedaling technique, but pedal forces have little relationship to what the muscles are doing, the real pedaling technique. So most of the studies have been studying the wrong thing. But there are studies that support that technique does relate to efficiency. Leerdahl demonstrated efficiency correlates well to what the rider does over top dead center. And Luttrell demonstrated a 10% increase in efficiency after training with power cranks. So, who's right? Let's look more closely and reach our own conclusion. Let's keep going. To a scientist or engineer, saying that pedaling technique has no effect on efficiency makes no sense. A more efficient force application, that is, if we can make those arrows more tangential to the pedal motion, it should increase efficiency. So why doesn't it when the scientists have actually looked at it? We can explain this inconsistency. Let's start with the definition of pedaling technique usually found in the literature. Again, pedaling technique in the literature is the pattern of force application measured at the pedals as shown. That seems to make sense, but it's a bad definition because it has no predictive value. Here's a better definition. Pedaling technique is the pattern of force application to the pedals that comes from the muscles and the muscles alone. So what's the difference? What these graphs show is the sum of total of 4 different forces, only one being the muscle force. It's what the muscles do that determine efficiency. So it's not only possible, but probable there is no correlation because what the muscles are doing is getting lost when combined with these other forces. Let's look deeper. What are these 4 forces? First, there's gravity, the weight of the leg on the pedals. This is always there, always down, mostly constant, and the size depends on the rider's build. Second, there are inertial forces from the constant acceleration and deceleration of the thigh and the lower leg pumping up and down. These depend upon the build of the rider, crank length, and cadence, and are mostly varying up and down. And third, there are centrifugal forces from the circular motion of the pedal trying to throw the foot off of the pedal. These depend upon the build of the rider, crank length, and cadence, and are aimed outwards from the pedal. And finally, the muscle forces pushing or pulling the foot around the circle to power the bike. What makes this especially hard to understand is that the muscles doing work on the upstroke cannot be seen through a force on the pedal, especially at low power. That doesn't mean they're not doing any work. Instead, they are only lifting the weight of the leg, increasing the potential energy of the leg, which is returned on the downstroke when the weight of the leg is added to the pushing muscle force. To complicate things even further, the initial and centrifugal forces, 2 and 3 on the list, vary with the square of the cadence. The higher the cadence, the more muddied the picture is. The muscle forces are getting lost in the noise that is all the other forces. No wonder there's little correlation looking at the total forces to the overall efficiency. Well, can anything be done to clear up the situation? Luckily, reverse engineering principles allow us to calculate and then eliminate the non-muscular forces. This isn't something you're going to do in your head or in the back of an envelope, but if we have enough information, it's possible to figure it out. Doing this helps us understand what the muscles are really doing or not doing. This was done for this case, and this is what the non-muscular forces look like for this rider under his tested condition. The important thing to take from this is these forces can be large, which is why this data is so hard to interpret. But all the non-muscular forces always average out to 0. Remember, all the actual power to the bicycle comes from the muscles. So if we subtract the non-muscular forces, the red line, from the total forces, the blue line, we can now see what the muscles are actually doing, the tan line. This is what I'm referring to as pedaling technique, as it shows what the muscles are doing to generate power in this individual. These are the forces that determine pedaling efficiency. Back to my question as to what is the difference between the definitions of pedaling technique. The difference is the difference between the blue and the tan line. And another thing is obvious. Even though we do some work around the entire circle, we do much more on the downstroke than in the back, and especially across the top. One more thing. I remember I mentioned Leerdahl correlating pedaling efficiency with what the rider does over top dead center. The interesting thing about top dead center, it's the weakest part of most people's pedal stroke, like here. And because the non-muscular forces are minimized here, it, along with the bottom of the stroke, is the part of the circle where the measured pedal forces represent actual muscle forces. Now you can understand why looking at pedal forces as pedaling technique is pretty useless, because this bears very little relationship to what the muscles are doing. Next, you should ask, Why do we pedal this way? Followed by, is there a better way? Well, we pedal this way because this is how we learned how to pedal as children, on platform pedals, and this pattern became ingrained in the brain when we were young, and it's now really, really, really hard to change. If you're right-handed now, how easy would it be to change to become left-handed? Well, it can be done, but there really is no reason to do so unless you lost your right arm. However, in cycling, there is a reason to put the hard work in to change your pedaling technique, because if you can change to a better technique, you can get a lot more power, and more power, of course, means more speed. Back to how you learned as a child. Your first bike had platform pedals. You were not connected to the pedals. On platform pedals, at the top, all that keeps your foot on the pedal is friction. As we learned earlier, the quads could be effective here, and the quads is a huge muscle and could generate a lot of power here if contracted hard. But if we push forward too hard, our foot will come flying off the pedal as we came over the top, because in about 10 degrees, the foot force and the pedal direction are going to be parallel. This doesn't work well when we're trying to pedal a bike, as you must keep contact with the pedal all the time. When we're not attached to the pedals, we must hold back from what the quads could do here, because the equipment dictates we do so if we want to maintain contact with the pedal. We have the same issue on the upstroke. On platform pedals, if we want to unweight too much, our foot again will come off the pedal. So again, one must hold back from what one could do just to ride the bike, maintaining some back pressure in order to keep contact with the pedal. At the bottom there is a similar issue, but we can tip our toe down to help us pull back without losing contact. Most of us are much better at the bottom of the stroke than at the top. This is how all of us learned how to pedal a bicycle, and how we did it for years. After that amount of time, it is ingrained. It is what you do. This background dictates how we all pedal as adults, unless we make a conscious effort to change. The question now is, are the muscles equal in capability? Can those weak areas be made the equal of the strong area? Let's look at the weakest area over the top, where the quads are the useful muscle. No one would claim the quads are not the equal of any other muscle used in pedaling. Using them properly should result in a huge power benefit. While there might be some subtle differences in ability based on this evidence, we should be at least striving to make the muscles work equally. I'll show you later how well we can do in this regard. We all know this intuitively, which is why cyclists started using toe clips and now clipless pedals. But becoming attached to the pedals only means you can change, not that you do change. So again, how to change this ingrained pattern? If it were easy, everyone would do it. But hardly anyone does, because the change is hard without feedback as to what you're doing or not doing. Luckily, that is what Power Cranks does. Power Cranks change this ingrained pattern to something better. Let's use all of those muscles. Power Cranks can do this because they are an operant conditioning device, in that Power Cranks give positive feedback when pedaling the entire circle, and immediate negative feedback when they stop doing so. Pedaling properly, they feel like normal cranks. Pedaling improperly, they just stop working. And because they are part of your regular training, one gets enough repetitions to eventually replace the previous ingrained pattern, and enough endurance into the necessary muscles to keep it up for hours. It is like taking a no-nonsense pedaling coach with you on every ride. I call it the no cheating approach to training. The key to power crank success is both the feedback and the repetitions. They eventually change the ingrained pattern of the pedaling while training up those undertrained muscles. Greg LeMond said to me after his first ride on power cranks, "I spent years learning how to pedal this way. Now everyone can learn it in months." Let's compare the technique of our typical rider with a long-term power cranker, pro triathlete Peter Vavrisek, who had about 10 years of training on power cranks when this test was done. Let's see how he pedals. Back to the total forces display. The blue is what we looked at before for a typical cyclist, and the green is Peter, a 10-year power cranker, both at 250 watts total, 125 watts per leg. It's clear one doesn't have to push particularly hard to have a good average, but it still looks like he gets most of his power from pushing down. Looking at these pedal forces, it would appear his muscles still are not well balanced. Is that true? Let's take away the non-muscular forces. Wow, that's about as even as one could possibly hope to get. There's no obviously strong or weak area in his pedal stroke. All four muscle groups are all contributing to his power, and they contribute about equally. What a change from how we learned how to pedal. The work he is doing is being distributed equally around the entire pedal circle. The work is being done by the four muscle groups is balanced. Power cranks do truly change how one pedals a bicycle to distribute the work more evenly. Power cranks really can undo the holding back pattern that was ingrained when we learned on platform pedals, so as to unleash the full potential of all of the muscles of the leg. A cyclist pedaling in this fashion can use all the muscles of the leg to their fullest potential. This is actually pedaling in circles. Yes, it is possible to train yourself to actually pedal this way. It's hard and it takes time, but it's worth it. You might be wondering why drills like isolated leg training don't work. First, one-legged training doesn't train the two-legged coordination, and few do it for more than a few minutes at a time. How's that going to train you for a 4 or 5 hour bike race? Isolated leg training is pretty much a waste of time, in my opinion, at least for the purpose of teaching pedaling technique. So far, I've addressed increasing the muscle mass used and the best coordination to maximize muscle foot force efficiency. But another completely separate area where improvement can be found is muscle contractile efficiency. Muscles contract with a max efficiency of around 40%. Cyclists usually have a gross efficiency of around 20%. Where are the losses, and can they be minimized? Some losses are unavoidable, and others can be minimized. The rest of the body has to stay alive, so that requires oxygen, so that reduces gross efficiency. The higher the power, the less this is a factor, so pros should have a higher gross efficiency than the rest of us, even if everything else is the same. There are also chain and bearing losses that cannot be made zero, and simply making the pedals go round, even at zero power, take energy. Interestingly, the energy required varies with the square of the cadence, or the square of the crank length, or to put another way, the square of the pedal speed. High cadences and long cranks can be especially inefficient. Lower pedal speeds reduce some of these losses, allowing more muscle effort to go towards powering the bicycle. But the muscle itself also has inefficiencies. Contract it too fast or too slow for any given power, and efficiency will drop. Again, for any given power, there will be an optimum force and contraction velocity to maximize the muscle efficiency. Too fast of a contraction rate or too slow a contraction rate will reduce muscle contraction efficiency and reduce overall cycling efficiency for any given power. The higher the power, the higher the optimum force and contraction velocity. This explains why you shouldn't be copying the technique of the pros, as they're probably putting out way more power than you are. You need to do what's best for you. So how do we control muscle contraction speed? That's easy. Pedal speed controls muscle contraction velocity. Martin has shown pretty conclusively that pedal speed is one of the few things that correlates well with cycling efficiency. That's because pedal speed correlates exactly with muscle contraction velocity. Biology. Pedal speed is another component of pedaling technique that we can control to increase efficiency. And how do we know what the best contraction velocity for any given power is? That's also easy. We can test for the best pedal speed. Here's an example of how. This is an elite age group triathlete who agreed to test his efficiency at various pedal speeds. He's a 10-year power cranker, so he has pretty much achieved all the benefits power cranks give to muscle balance, so we can look at the effects of pedal speed alone. The test was done near his normal racing power. The test was done on a wide range of crank lengths and cadences over several weeks. Pedal speeds range from about 0.85 meters per second to 2.5 meters per second. We can see the curve is similar in shape whether he's having a good day or a bad day, and that his maximum efficiency at this power, 200 watts, is about a pedal speed of 1.1 to 1.2 meters per second. He used to ride long cranks at a cadence of about 90 to 100. He now races on 145 cranks at about a cadence of 80 and is seeing an approximate 20 watt or 10% power increase despite being older. In this athlete, just getting him to a better pedal speed resulted in a 10% increase in power. This is something anyone can do. No power cranks required. However, I believe this is one of the elements accounting for part of those huge power increases many power crankers report because they are so hard in the beginning, the new user naturally slows down their cadence just to be able to get any endurance at all. The first ride lasting about 5 to 10 minutes in most people. And most will adapt to something better for them unless they consciously try to ride what they think they should be doing, following the pros, riding those higher cadences. So let's review. There are 3 elements that can be manipulated beyond training more or harder that can improve cycling power and endurance. First, the amount of muscle mass involved in the pedal stroke can usually be increased. Second, the pedaling coordination or using those muscles at the optimum time for best efficiency can usually be improved. And third, changing pedal speed to keep the muscles contracting at the most efficient rate and minimizing the other mechanical losses for the power being generated can be trained. Power cranks help with all of these. That is why they are so powerful as a training tool. So what does this lead to? A 2006 Canadian study looking at power cranks training in trained cyclists using 100% immersion training for 8 hours per week demonstrated a 15% increase in VO2 max and an 11% increase in power in 6 weeks. VO2 max measures how much muscle mass is being exercised. The increase in VO2 max reflects the fact that the cyclists are starting to use all of the muscles of the legs more fully in the pedal stroke, and of course, this is reflected in the power increase also. Most of our users are seeing 25 to 40% increase in power after 6 months of immersion training. This usually gives 2 to 3 mile an hour bike speed improvement, and I'm ignoring the running improvement most triathletes see. What does such improvement do for your bike split if you're an Ironman? Well, we expect the better people to see slightly smaller increases, so if you're at the pointy end, you might see a 10 to 20 minute bike improvement. If you're pretty slow now, you could see over an hour bike improvement in 6 months. Here are some more examples. After training with power cranks, Sam Guide won his age group for 4 years in a row despite swimming in the 110 range. Helps to have a 430 to 440 bike split. His bike split is usually the fastest of the age groupers and a top 10 overall at Kona. He passes a lot of people because of that swim time. There are lots of examples like this. Getting really good on the bike is possible, even as an amateur. Phil Holman didn't believe our claims. Remember, many people believe such improvements are impossible. So he took us up on a dare to use them as we suggested and then report back to the group. Not a bad result, I would say. He didn't measure power, but those speed improvements calculate to about a 30% increase in power, everything else being equal. The key here is time in the saddle with them. Take them seriously, and you should see serious results. Here's another example, a Spanish cyclist who is professionally tested by a national team coach. He saw a 50-watt increase in his sustainable power in about 1 year. Also of note, here is an increase in VO2 max of 13% in 7 months and 17% in 13 months, evidence he is now using more muscle mass. And this accounts for about half of his 39% improvement in FTP1 in 1 year. So we can conclude that this huge increase in FTP1 only occurred because of multiple factors, increased muscle mass plus other increased efficiencies. He was told he was now at a pro level. The only issue was his age, as he would not recover like the pros. Now that you understand there are many elements to pedaling technique that can be important to power generation and efficiency, let's discuss crank length. If you listen to many of the experts out there, they will tell you that crank length has no effect on power. Let's examine this more closely. What is the evidence? In my opinion, the best study on this is done by Martin, where he looked at maximum power using riders using different crank lengths. In this study, power was highest using the 145 millimeter crank length. 145 was better than 170. What? But what really boggled my mind about this is the author looked at this data and concluded that because the difference was small and didn't reach statistical significance, that we could continue riding 170 cranks no problem. The question I have for this author and for anyone using this study as proof crank length doesn't matter is why would any serious competitor want to give up any power, small or not? It seems to me a better conclusion would be this surprising result needed more study. The toughest part of a scientific study is not the data collection, but rather the interpretation. Sometimes what you read in the scientific literature makes no sense. But beyond this, there are a couple of issues with this study that specifically affect triathletes. Here is the real problem with that data. It looked at male riders in the upright cycling position. And the data suggests that with more subjects, there would have been a small but statistically significant difference. In addition, he didn't look at the arrow position where one might expect crank length to be even more important. What is even stranger is if you pay someone to do a bike fit, few do anything with crank length. Even though crank length dictates everything else about the bike fit. Most bike fitters simply fit the athlete to the cranks that are on their bike. Why do both bike shops and bike fitters do this? The answer probably involves two things. First, money, because it costs both the manufacturer and bike shops a lot to offer this flexibility. But more importantly, no one really has a clue what crank length really is best for you or for anyone else, so they all just pretend it doesn't matter. If someone says they have a crank length formula, ask them what science it's based on. There will be none. So let's look at the crank length now and how it might affect power. So let's go back to the study. Would this data look the same if done on smaller people or women? My guess is everything would be shifted to the left, looking at smaller people. But more importantly, how many triathletes race in an upright riding position? And for short people in the arrow position, the problem is amplified. When is someone going to do a study of power and crank length in the arrow position and correlate it with people of different sizes? It doesn't matter because you can now easily do this study for yourself, on yourself, to see what is best for you. Isn't that what really counts? Here's an example of what one of our customers did. This athlete has an espresso bike system, which is similar to a CompuTrainer, in that it saves previous rides and lets you ride against yourself or other athletes over prescribed courses. In this instance, he rode a course twice in an identical fashion, only changing crank length from 175 to 145. Here is the heart rate profile for 2 rides. You can see his heart rate averaged 10 beats per minute lower with the shorter cranks, demonstrating an efficiency improvement. This is the kind of experimenting everyone can do and should do to find the optimum crank length for them. Most of our customers who have seriously experimented with this have gone shorter, with many settling on crank lengths in the 135 to 155 range. Pro triathlete Courtney Ogden won Ironman Western Australia using 145 millimeter cranks. How can you tell if your current cranks might be too long without doing that testing? Well, here's a simple test to get you started. Take your current crank length and double it. That is how high your cranks force you to lift your foot every revolution. For 170 cranks, that's about 14 inches. Now stand on the floor and lift one foot. You should have no trouble lifting way more than 14 inches because you do that every time you get on the bike and clip in. Now bend at the waist and put yourself in a really good arrow position, back and chest flat, parallel to the ground. Now lift that foot and see how high you can get it off the floor. If you're anywhere close to 14 inches, you're probably a circus contortionist. You are now getting an idea as to how crank length affects performance in a good arrow position and what the longest crank length you should be riding if you want to be in an excellent arrow position and still generate good power. You will see that the lower you are, the harder it is to lift your foot. And if you are too low, you're going to lose power unless your cranks are shorter. I think this is so important that most Power Cranks models now allow for you to experiment over a wide range to help you figure this out without guessing. Don't let your equipment limit your potential because it's easiest for the bike manufacturers and bike shops to have a one-size-fits-all approach to crank length. You just have to do the testing for yourself as to what is best for you. You should ride the longest cranks you can that allow you to attain an excellent arrow position without losing power or efficiency. Power cranks make this easy for you to figure out because most of our models have adjustable crank lengths so you can experiment and find out what works best for you. Here is how going arrow affected the efficiency of our pedal speed tester. Remember him? The shape of the curve is still the same and his best pedal speed is still the same, but his efficiency is somewhat lower. Hopefully his improved aerodynamics should more than make up for the difference. The best crank length is the one that lowers the efficiency the least while improving aerodynamics the most. One other thing, while shorter cranks can make it easier for you to get over the top of the stroke, they also naturally reduce pedal speed. This probably explains the Martin result. So now we have seen that a shorter crank length doesn't necessarily lower power and might even raise it. Let's look at how changing crank length affects bike fit. When you shorten your cranks 10 millimeters, you should raise your seat 10 millimeters to keep your fit at the bottom of the stroke about the same. Here I am on 190 cranks. Notice my elbows are about the level of my seat, a fit many of you probably have. Not as bad as some, but pretty high in front. Watch the change as I shorten my cranks to 90 millimeters. The white lines compare how the fit changed as I shortened the cranks, raising the seat, but not moving the handlebars. Note as the cranks shortened, the drop increased from the seat to the bars almost 100 millimeters. The back and chest flattened, making for a smaller frontal area. Plus there is a less cramped hip angle at the top of the stroke, which allowed me to drop my bars further, if I could do so without losing power, making for an even smaller frontal area. In our experience, most people can also drop their bars about the same amount as they shorten their cranks, doubling the position change seen here. I think it's clear that this one simple change, shortening crank length, can potentially improve both aerodynamics and your ability to generate power. If power isn't lost going shorter then, what isn't to like here if your goal is to go faster? If you don't experiment with this for yourself, you're wasting a big opportunity to find some free speed. Now let's move on to talk about the new power and technique measuring devices coming to the market. These measure the power of each leg independently and have the potential to give pedaling technique information. Regardless of the product in question, you should be asking is, will the information be useful to you? I've already shown you that the vector output display is almost impossible to interpret. Watch out for devices with that kind of display. It looks pretty cool, but it's pretty worthless for learning anything that will help you. But there is an output that is useful, in my opinion. With a polar display, balanced muscle use displays as a circle. It is offset a bit to the right because of gravity, but it minimizes the confounding effects of those non-muscular forces. Remember the pro triathlete Peter Vabrusek? This is what his pedaling stroke looked like using a polar display. Here I have superimposed a circle in black over his actual stroke in green. They are almost identical. With a polar display, the circular pedal stroke looks like a circle. Isn't that amazing? What does a more normal cyclist look like? Here's a technique of a cyclist I measured at an expo. What can we say about his technique weaknesses looking at this? Well, the red negative stands out, but that really doesn't mean anything, especially at a low power like this. The better question is, how circular is it? It is the circularity that defines balance or evenness. From a circular point of view, let's look to the left leg for this analysis. If he looks squashed at both the back and the top from about 6-to-1, my eyeball says this is where he is weak. Next, I have superimposed a true circle over his technique to see how close I got by eyeballing it. Comparing to the true circle, it looks like my eyeball assessment wasn't bad, but his stroke is even worse than I imagined. What we can see is this display actually gives us useful information that we can interpret and use if we are interested in discovering pedaling technique weaknesses and improving them. This rider has weak hamstrings, hip flexors, and quads compared to his glutes. Of course, power cranks uncover and correct most of these weaknesses without displaying them. Measuring them, though, can reassure us they have done their job. This guy isn't very good. Next, let's look at the display of a pretty good cyclist. This is the technique of an already excellent cyclist, but not power cranks trained. Remember how we learned to pedal as a child? This guy is really good across the bottom, but typically is weak across the top. The weak portion of his stroke are the hip flexors and the quads. Or it could be his cranks are too long. Power cranks would pretty much fix this for him. As Peter shows, we don't have to be weak on the top half of the stroke. The previous rider is missing out on a lot of untapped power simply because he hasn't addressed pedaling technique adequately. In summary, I've talked about a lot of stuff here, and as we gather new information from all these new gadgets coming to the market, we might actually learn what really is best. For sure, no one knows now where this will end, but I'm willing to predict a few things now will be found to be absolutely true. The best technique for riding a bicycle when one is attached to the pedals is not what we learned as kids, but a more balanced technique that uses all of the major muscles of the leg to pedal the entire circle. Using more muscles when pedaling is better than using fewer. And most cyclists are pedaling at cadences too high that are robbing them of power. Pedal speed counts a lot. And most triathletes are using cranks that are too long for them, frequently way too long. If you can't get your foot easily over the top, this robs you of power or is putting you in a poor aerodynamic position, or both. And if you can do it all, that really means big, big, big potential improvements. Power cranks do the heavy lifting, pretty much fixing all of the big problems I have been talking about without you needing to think about anything. If you will only use them. Peter transformed his technique to almost perfect circles by simply training on the power cranks and not caring what his stroke looked like. Power cranks allows you to transform your pedaling technique and at the same time experiment with crank length and figure out a more effective pedal speed all in one tool. Make power cranks part of your regular training and you will see improvements you can only dream about now. Now, a short comment about the future. All of this work has got me thinking about how can this efficiency data be given to the athlete on their power meter. I think I've figured it out and have recently applied for a patent on my idea. It will simply be a number, the higher the better, that gives the rider an estimate of balance and efficiency. I think I will call it the effin number. Effin for efficiency index. And because improving it is effing hard, at least if you don't have power cranks. I will hold off on saying more until I have validated it. Stay tuned. Let me leave you with this. All you have to do to correct and improve most of what I have talked about today is train with power cranks. And you will bike faster, run faster, guaranteed. Thanks for listening.